First of all, let me thank the organizers of this excellent summit for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to be on a panel with Abhijit Banerjee and Paul Krugman. So let me begin by saying that, Abhijit is, of course, one of the stars of development economics. And for those of you who haven't read his book, Poor Economics, please, it's compulsory reading for anyone who wants to understand development. As for Paul Krugman, what can I say? He's my hero, and I'm completely in awe of him. And I'm being almost 90% honest when I say I begin every morning first by reading the Arsenal blog and then the Paul Krugman blog. That's absolutely compulsory reading. And if people want to know what I really think about him, I wrote a piece on him after he won the Nobel Prize called The Professor and the Pundit. You should go and check it out. That's what I think about Professor Krugman. So it's a great honor to be here with both of these distinguished people. I think it's also an excellent time to review on the eve of President Obama's visit, and in the context of improving relationships between the two countries, I think it's an appropriate time to discuss the U.S.-India economic relationship and the impact of rising U.S. growth, which is the title of this topic, of this session. So can I have the PowerPoint, please? Yeah. Okay. So 4 key takeaways I want to leave you with. One, this is a relationship that's underpinned fundamentally by human capital flows, but with a lot of unrealized potential. The cliche about, the people-to-people relationship is strong, but the rest of the relationship, especially the government has been, wanting in many areas. That cliche is absolutely true. And so that's one key aspect to take away. The second, I think, is that the potential is unrealized fundamentally because it's an asymmetric relationship. Let's be honest. The U.S. is the world's largest economy, not in PPP terms, but in market exchange rate terms. And India is much smaller, per capita GDP much lower. And so this is an asymmetric relationship. And it can only be rectified, frankly, by Indian growth of 8% for the next 2 to 3 decades. As a great Indian statesman puts it, India's best foreign economic policy is domestic growth of 8% for India. Then I want to touch upon the short run. I think rising U.S. growth is actually, on balance, good for India. But I think in the medium run, I worry that the pattern of U.S. growth, especially what I call in my book the beleaguered middle class problem, I think that's going to limit the positive impact of the United States on the world and in India in particular. So let me quickly run through a few aspects of these relationships, highlighting what I think are really interesting things about this relationship. As I said, this is a relationship that's fundamentally pinned by the human capital flows. And surprisingly, there are 2 things that are very interesting about this. My former colleague, Jacob Kierkegaard, he's actually shown that if you actually tally up how much temporary Indian workers receive in the US by way of wages, it's about $45 to $50 billion. So in a sense, the US contributes to Indian national welfare of about 45 to 50 billion, and that number is much greater than trade flows and even services flows correctly recorded. So that's I think fundamentally a fact that I wasn't aware of, that if you tally up this, it's actually quite big. The second, I think, really interesting point, which people haven't really caught on to, I think perversely, India actually provides foreign aid to the United States of about $3 billion. And I say Indian, but actually it's Indian workers paying to the US government by way of Social Security contributions $3 billion that they will never recover. Because of the laws, you have to be there 10 years before you can collect Social Security. So Ken Rogoff used to say cheekily that, China ran the most massive foreign aid program in favor of the US because of, buying cheap, providing cheap finance to the United States by way of its treasury holdings things. I would like to submit that unlike that foreign aid program, which is entirely voluntary, the Indian aid program is involuntary. We do want this to be changed. So that's why I think one of the major issues that need to be addressed is a kind of totalization agreement that will allow Indian workers to recover the $3 billion in aid that they're providing every year to the US government. The second, on trade itself, I think it's substantial, it's asymmetric, but in a perverse way, it's also balanced. US-India trade has been growing very rapidly, faster than all kinds of Indian trade except Indian-Asian trade. But India and India and the US are still under traders. If you do it kind of academically, it's about 30%. So even there, the potential is unrealized. Unlike US-China trade, which is interesting, which I want to show you here, is that this is the bilateral trade surplus with the US, and you can see China, huge surpluses, a source of big friction. In the case of India, it's broadly a balanced relationship, and therefore less scope for friction on this score. But the other point, of course, is that the asymmetric nature of this. The US is our largest market for our exports. It's probably the second largest source of our imports. But the other way around, we matter less for the US, both in terms of export markets and sources of imports. And that's the sense in which the US-India relationship is kind of asymmetric. The last point I want to say is about FDI, which is very important for all the things that India is trying to do, and what the Prime Minister said yesterday. The US is the largest source of FDI for India, measured over a certain period of time. But the interesting thing is that India also exports FDI to the US. So it's kind of a two-way flow of FDI, which kind of confounds the pattern of specialization internationally, because you don't expect poor countries like India to actually be exporting FDI, and you don't expect countries like India to be exporting FDI to much richer countries than itself. And this is a kind of interesting aspect of the US-India relationship. And this two-way FDI, of course, opens up interesting possibilities for bilateral investment cooperation, because if it were one way, then one country is asking and the other country is having to give. Sure, there's kind of a mutuality which makes it easier to achieve cooperation. So what about US growth in the short run? I think, first of all, it has to be said that if the US grows faster, our exports of services and goods will increase substantially. Almost, some number, 60% of our services exports goes to the US. So that impact up to first order has to be unambiguously positive. But the other interesting channel is the financial and monetary channel, because after all, last year, it's the taper tantrum that was the trigger for the disruption in Indian financial markets amongst other emerging market countries. And this year, of course, that's a real possibility, and Paul will have more insights into this, is that the US will revert to normal monetary policy, which is another way of saying that they will raise interest rates. And so the question is, will there be disruption in India? The reason to slightly worry is that since December, actually, we've had substantial inflows. Since December, my calculations, we had about $40 billion in inflows, of which about 60% is actually interest-sensitive, debt inflows. So any increase in interest rates potentially could lead to disruption. But I think this time around it's going to be very different, because India's situation, macroeconomic situation, is fundamentally different from what it was about 16, 17 months ago. And also, so that's India relative to its past. But if you look at India relative to other countries today, India looks a much brighter prospect. So even if there's some kind of disruption, I think it will be limited, because India's fundamentals are better. So, where will investors take their money to apart from the US and India is kind of the question I want to leave you with in the short run. But I think the most interesting question for me is the medium-term outlook. If you think about the US recovery over the last 2, 3, whatever years you want to, and even the most recent data, my former colleague, Mike Musa, who was chairman of the International Monetary Fund, said that this is a Republican recovery. Basically, all the gains are going to people at the top, not just at the top, at the very, very top. And this is something that Paul has written about extensively. So I would call this a kind of Republican Piketty recovery. So the reason this is very important, because this recovery, still in its early stages, still not entirely durable, one really has to doubt whether it has the ability to ameliorate what I've called in my book the real problem in the United States. It's the beleaguered middle class problem, which, what does it mean? And remember, this problem has been underway in the US not for 5 years, not for 10 years, but at least for 2 to 3 decades. In fact, probably after the second oil shock. Productivity growth has been slow. Median wages have been stagnant. There's been rising inequality, which everyone has noted. There's declining mobility, and certainly less mobility than there used to be, and less mobility compared to other countries. And of course, a really politically polarized system in the United States. So this is not a country that, even if it grows, will have the economic wherewithal, the political wherewithal to actually sustain something that's very, very important for India and the world. And what is that? Is the US commitment to openness. In the aftermath of World War II, the US as the benign hegemon, depending on how you look, not always benign, not benign from everyone's point of view, but broadly benign hegemon, created the international economic system, very open, benefited most developing countries. But that US commitment to openness is actually now under question. Two manifestations of that. The United States is the only major country that's not signed up to the IMF quota replenishment since about 2010 when it was negotiated. And really, people are beginning to worry about whether it's ever going to be possible. That's one. And of course, US immigration policy. There was a Senate bill on immigration, which actually is fairly adverse, even hostile to Indian skilled labor exports. So one has to worry about the ability of the United States, even if it's growing, because it's not growing with gains distributed across the spectrum, its commitment to openness is in question. Now, like many of us, we believe that ideas matter, and I think this commitment to openness, for me, the most interesting and challenging part of it is the following. So I've made this presentation, not this one, but the next question. So here's a puzzle, for a quiz for all of you. What is common to Paul Samuelson, Larry Summers, Alan Blinder, Joe Stiglitz, Michael Spence, and Paul Krugman? So this is a heavyweight list of American intellectuals. There are, by my count, 6 intellectuals, 5 John Bates Clark winners, and 4 Nobel Prize winners. And what is common to all of them? And what is common to all of them is the following. Each of them, in a different way, and we can go into what the different way is, has expressed reservations about globalization. And this is, in some ways, an intellectual climate change in the United States. So it's not just the political system, the middle class, that's kind of expressing reservations about openness and the commitment to openness, which, as I said, is very important for labor policy for India, for an open system more generally. But this intellectual climate change has to be something that's worrying for all of us in the long run, because, the US is still, even though it's a kind of declining power and China is the rising power, there is a sense in which we still want the United States to be strong and leading this. So this intellectual climate change is something that worries me a lot. So I want to leave you with one question for one of the panelists, which I want to say as et tu, Paul.
Thank you. Just to wrap off, before I ask Professor Krugman to answer this, could I just ask you one question? Would you like to revisit your eclipse thesis, given the different ability of the US and China to handle adverse global situations?
Remember, the thesis in Eclipse, there was a positive diagnosis and a policy prescription. The positive diagnosis was that, there's a weakening West and the weakening US and a rising China. So that fundamentally alters the open system and the way we've had it. But the policy prescription there was that, we needed much more multilateral approaches to deal with the rise of China. Before President Obama's last visit here, I actually had briefed him. And what I said was that, India, like the United States, has an issue with Chinese exchange rate policy. And the interesting thing was in this diagnosis was that, the US needed to realize that it couldn't take China on alone, and that it needed a bunch of like-minded people to address what were common concerns on Chinese exchange rate policies. Equally for India, it had to realize that, that it mattered but didn't matter too much. It had to be part of a coalition to help deal with China, but it couldn't just retreat and say, well, the US is still the hegemon, the US should take on China. So I think that diagnosis, is that prescriptive thing is fundamentally, unaltered. I still think we need multilateral approaches. I still think we need a strong United States. But I think we need a strong United States, but also backed by, a genuinely healthy, economically healthy, in the sense of, gains spread across the spectrum, because that's what's going to underpin its commitment to openness.
Professor Krugman, would you respond to Professor Subramaniam?
I guess the first thought would be if all of those people have some reservations about globalization, might that not be because there is some good reason to have some reservations about globalization? I mean, none of the, Alan Blinder has, I know, a colleague of mine, and he's proposed on several occasions that economists should have T-shirts that say "Yay, free trade" on them. So he's certainly in favor of free trade. But I think there's a realistic appreciation that there have been some downsides, particularly, by the way, on capital flows, which even my old teacher, Jagdish Bhagwati, has long been worried about. So no, I think it's a reasonable response. In some ways, it's a response to the very issue that you've been raising, which is the beleaguered middle class in the United States. That obviously, protectionism is not the route, but to say that we do have problems which are in some ways exacerbated by globalization, and that we need to accept that fact is a reasonable thing. But that's I think we have bigger problems than the lack of complete 100% unshadowed support on the part of liberal economists for globalization.
So, I see what Paul is saying. In a sense, it's really, to put it very directly, that, for people like Paul and others, by the way, I must say that list, I forgot to mention that what's common to all of them is that they're complete cosmopolitans, and they're not insular protectionists by any means, and that actually compounds the worry for all of us. So in a sense, it raises the question of, the tension between domestic welfare and global welfare, and where, people stand on this is something that from the point of view of a developing country, it is a source of concern, Paul, that, immigration could be affected, trade flows could be affected. See, on capital, I think it's a completely different conversation. I think we all believe that, one should be cautious about capital flows. So I think that's not, it's more on the real side, the trade and the labor side, that we really, really worry, because for us, if India is to grow like China did, here's a stylized fact. I think very few, at least in the post-war period, very few economic transformations have happened, i.e. gangbuster growth of 7, 8, 9% without rapid export growth. You cannot grow at 8% sustainably based on the domestic market. That's completely inconsistent. So for us, it's really important that foreign markets remain open if we are to achieve the transformation that you eloquently spoke about yesterday, Paul.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, let me, if you have I know you need to go, let me say that partly you do need to understand what I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, but there is a political and a political economy context within the United States, which is that we are deeply, deeply divided, and on issues that in many ways matter as much or more to developing countries as trade policy, environmental policy, climate change, and so on. And if you are someone of my position, what I guess would be a social democrat in Europe, and you have you have people who are allies of yours on most of those issues. What's left of the U.S. labor movement, a fair number of people who are less enthused about globalization than you might like them to be. Not to say that you don't disagree with them, but is fighting with them over that issue a priority? I mean, I've actually had a conversation with with Robert Kuttner, who's an intellectual much more on that side, and serious opponent of free trade. And we agreed that although we continue to disagree about some of those issues, while we were fighting about trade policy 15, 20 years ago, Sauron was gathering his forces in Mordor. Our common opponents, who are really, really bad people and for America and for the world, are a more important cause than what exactly you think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Take care.
Abhijit, would you like to react to this particular thesis? When the US is the fastest growing economy in the world, really large, others have slowed down considerably. It obviously has an impact on development. The process of people getting out of poverty that has been happening on an unprecedented scale. Now, how will that be affected?
So who's on first?
I guess I didn't fully understand the question. You mean, do you think how we take the good news in the US growing, or how we take the bad news of the rest of the world? I mean, I think that it just underscores the fact that I think the first order, I didn't react to this conversation between Arvind and Paul, partly because I'm one of these people who believes that to first approximation, we spend too much time obsessing about how free trade is. I think this is second order relative to everything else that's wrong with the global economy and our internal economy. And I think we can spend lots of time fighting that particular battle, internally and externally, and I don't think it's worth the energy. At the margin, I think, a large economy like India, I just don't think the evidence is that the magnitudes of the effect of free trade are anything as large as. I think going from where we were in 1990 to where we were in 1997 was extraordinarily important. We were an insane economy. But I don't know at the margin whether or not this particular. So, having said that, I think so. I think that we do trade a fair amount now. We're much more open. I think this is a very difficult world to be negotiating right now. That's the first. I think the first order fact. And I'm going to predict that it's going to be a difficult world for a long time. I think one of the things we're going to are beginning to see is an adjustment to the fact that Europe is aging. It's not having children. I think the long term on Europe and Japan, with fertility rates often of 1.5, 1.7, it's just somehow that story, the productivity growth isn't big enough to make that story work out. So I don't see how these economies are going to continue to draw the weight they have in the world economy. They are not very comfortable with it. I mean, that would be. I think some of them have more immigration. I was surprised. Italy seems to have more immigration than one would imagine. But I think in general, if you right now, the reaction to what happened in Paris is not going to be lots more openness to immigration in Europe. So I'm just very pessimistic about these low demographics economies. I think they are in the middle of what's going to be a long-term readjustment of expectations. And I think we should be prepared for that.
Professor Krugman, one specific problem. If the US is the fastest growing large economy, and it actually wants to act as and serves as the engine of global growth, it will once again mean the US building up a huge current account deficit. And once again, large capital flows moving to the US, again creating the liquidity glut and the problems we saw during the financial crisis. Do you think this is a possibility?
I think not. I mean, so first thing to say is when we talk about the U.S. Being the growth leader, that is really more of a reflection of the failure of other countries than of the success of the United States. If you want to if you compare where we are in America now with where 7 years ago we thought we would be at this point, it's actually been an enormous economic disaster. Growth has fallen far short. Employment has fallen far short. It's just that we're relieved to see that things are finally improving definitively, but but it's been a really terrible, hard slog. And I would say that between the United States and Europe, there has, in effect, been a competition as to which side of the Atlantic could screw up worse, which could do a worse job in responding to the financial crisis. And the Europeans do appear to have won that competition. But that's not a lot of cause for joy in the United States. Now, what we do see in the U.S. is, I think if you ask why now, why are things finally looking seriously better, some of the hangovers from the excesses have been worked off. We've built very few houses since 2006, so we have effectively a great need for housing. We've had substantial deleveraging by households, so we're ready there. And the de facto fiscal austerity that was such a drag on the United States has finally tapered off. States and local governments are spending again. The federal government is not doing so much to drag things down. But that's a very far cry from a roaring boom. Not clear why that would lead to a massive inflow. That story of the mid-2000s was one of a housing and mortgage and consumer debt boom, and it's very hard to see that happening again for a while. It's just not going to happen. So what I do think is an issue is how much international linkage is there? The United States is certainly big enough that it could, in principle, continue to prosper despite difficulties abroad, but that would presuppose that the policy response was adequate. And given the reality, given a strengthening dollar that will be a drag on U.S. net exports, given that there's some psychological contagion. If you look at, actually, the market has spoken. U.S. long-term interest rates are right back down to what they were before the taper. Despite the fact that the U.S. economic news has been pretty good lately, and the markets are in effect saying that they believe that the U.S. is not immune to what's going on in the rest of the world. I think that may be a bit of an overreaction, but let's put it this way. It seems to me that to be worried about the next bubble is way premature. The fact of the matter is we're still living in the shadow. Can we be living in the shadow of a bubble? Anyway, bad metaphor, but we're still very much suffering from the old one. We have in no sense recovered from that. So that's where we are right now.
This entire liquidity buildup that the U.S. did through its quantitative easing, which has brought down U.S. interest rates to what they are now.
I just disagree. That's not what's doing it. I mean, just not true. Sorry, okay. But no, it's not QE. I mean, the U.S. interest rates are low fundamentally. Long rates are low because people expect short rates to be low for a very long time. And people expect short rates to be low for a very long time because they think that the expansion is fundamentally weak, that there's a drag. If you want to blame someone for the low rates right now, don't blame Ben Bernanke, don't blame Janet Yellen, blame Larry Summers, who made secular stagnation popular as a concept, and the markets now believe him, which has me very annoyed because I was trying to say the same thing, but I said it badly a month before he did. So anyway, Larry, but that means I can also blame him for the markets.
I don't have anything particularly interesting to say on this.
One result of interest rates being so low in the US and European economies is that it offers an opportunity. If a country like India is actually able to offer sound investment opportunities, where if you deploy money, there is some guarantee that the returns will actually filter back to the home countries, a huge lot of money could come in to build the infrastructure countries like India desperately need. Do you think this possibility is real, or will there be too much fear and nervousness about taking money out of these countries?
Take a little
Yeah. So, yeah. Go ahead.
I guess I think that our primary problem. I think it's fine to have the U.S. as being somehow a conversation starter on this, but our primary problem is domestic. Our financial sector. Our banking sector is broken like nobody's business, more broken than it's ever been, in my view. And in that form, I do feel that we're in, I think the people who need the money, the infrastructure sector, is massively in debt and not able to cover its debt. It's really, I think the bad news is that the money, even if people came to us with tons of money to borrow, I don't think we are in a position to borrow. I just don't think that I think our fundamental problem isn't one of worrying about regulation. It's one of basically, we don't have the kind of equity that we should have had. I think one of the consequences of the last 4 years was, I think, very large number of infrastructure and power companies that are on paper probably still not bankrupt, but I think in effect bankrupt. And I think that's our fundamental, unless we solve that problem, I think all the capital sloshing around is not going to go anywhere unless the government is willing to borrow, which I don't think it will. So I think it's really like, I don't think that's an issue for us right now. I think the issue is...
I would say that I'm actually thinking, I'm thinking on my feet, even though I'm sitting here, and these very low interest rates clearly offer an opportunity for people who have something useful to do to borrow. And so, and this is what people like me have been saying very much about governments in the West, that this is crazy. We have private sector doesn't seem to want this stuff. It's willing to lend you money at zero or even negative real interest rates, and we have infrastructure needs to go and do it. And the warning has always been, oh yes, but you run up debt and terrible things will happen, which turns out not to be true for governments. It's really just, there's a mythology about that which is not borne out by the evidence. On the other hand, it is very much the case that countries that run up large foreign debts, even on very favorable interest rates, do have a remarkable tendency to find themselves in traffic accidents. Now, arguably, arguably that has a lot to do with the tendency to borrow denominated in foreign currency. So whatever else, India should not be out there borrowing in dollars and euros. That's been a recipe for disaster so many times. It's not clear that borrowing in your own currency is a complete insulation either. That depends on what you think about what happened to the U.S. with its housing bubble, which was also a foreign borrowing bubble. But but in general, I think Abhijit is right that the problem of access to capital is not the core. I mean, it probably makes sense. Certainly, I mean, a little bit. I've talking to Arvind off stage that to borrow for infrastructure makes quite a lot of sense given current rates and given the India situation. But that's government borrowing. But the problem, the international capital flows have not been the route to prosperity, the route to success for anybody, basically ever. I mean, it's done some good things. You can argue that infrastructure has been built with foreign capital in a useful way, but in general, the idea that getting access to cheap foreign money is just what you need it doesn't necessarily lead to disaster, but it's never been the real driver of growth.
In fact, part of we do have something of a foreign borrowing problem. It's all in the private sector. There's a bunch of private sector companies which, in the go-go years of borrowing, after 2009 and before 2011, basically borrowed a bunch at very low interest rates, and since then the rupee depreciated by 50%. So it has a substantial effect, obviously, on their balance sheets, and that's not a small part of what is holding back our infrastructure system.
That's right. I mean, I think all of us who've tried to work this work, it's sort of yes, but it's not as bad as Indonesia in 1998, which is true, but maybe that's setting too low a bar.
12% GDP decline in 1 year.
Now, if capital could actually not go to the US, but go directly to where there are investment opportunities, where the money could be deployed, perhaps the US itself will not solve this problem.
I think there is this real tendency to overstate and to place too much emphasis on official purchases of assets and on things like reserve currency status. Go back 50 years. At that point the dollar was already the dominant international reserve currency, but there was a second reserve currency that was still fairly important, which was the pound sterling. And at the end of the 60s, early 70s, the pound completely collapsed as a reserve currency. It just the international role of sterling disappeared. And that is why, of course, London is not a major financial center, right? Come on, there are two giant financial centers in the world right now. One is New York, one is London. One of them is inside a country that is a global key currency. One is inside a country that is not a global key currency. In fact, is not even part of the currency union, the big currency union across the water from it. And that hasn't stopped London from being essentially the same size, or maybe even bigger than New York as a center of international intermediation. So I don't think that's the issue. And it's not the case that it could be the case, I suppose, that China or Japan, that sovereign wealth funds could be investing directly, and that does happen to some extent, but all this intermediation is taking place for a reason, and it's not just because it happens to be that the Chinese have been putting their stuff in dollars. It's a really quite different role.
No, even granting that all the money that came to the US and London were not official reserves, but were primarily private flows. These deployment of official reserves in these liquid markets certainly did add to the problem, don't you think?
Yeah. No, maybe. I'm sorry. I'm jumping in, but we do talk about the world seems to want more safe assets than the final borrowers are prepared to supply, and so we have these very large financial sectors that are devoted to creating allegedly safe assets for people to invest in, and that has not worked out that well, but it's still happening. And so you could say that London and New York both are in the business of creating fake safe assets, and that has been a problem. But it's not clear. Yeah, it would certainly help if governments were not also demanding safe assets. I think that's probably the way to put it.
But I think that hopefully some lessons have been learned, and so I do feel that part of I think we shouldn't start with the view that what happened in 2008-9 was entirely sort of built into the structure of financial markets. I think there was a regulatory void. A deliberate ignoring of every possible signal. So I do think that this idea that somehow cheap capital is very dangerous for the world is partly posited on, this couple of episodes. Maybe the Latin American debt crisis was a bit that, and now the recent one was that. But I don't think that one should start with the idea that regulation had nothing to do with it. I think this was engineered by a particular regulatory stance in the US, which I think was, it was irresponsible to putting it very mildly.
I think we actually have a mild difference here, because maybe
not a mild.
I agree that the regulatory stance matters, although one thing that's interesting is how similar ultimately the European housing bubble and collapse and the US housing bubble and collapse, the outline is very much the same, even though the regulatory environments were very different. You could argue that deregulation was taking place in one way or another on both sides of the Atlantic, but it happened. And I would not say this is a couple of episodes. I would say Latin American debt crisis, tequila crisis in Mexico, the East Asian financial crisis, which when it happened seemed like it was the biggest thing ever. It now looks trivial compared with what happened later.
That was not so much a cheap money crisis.
It was a large capital flows crisis. There was some. I would actually say that what has happened within Europe is more a capital flows crisis than, they've insisted on viewing it as a fiscal crisis, but that's not. That's a German reinterpretation of the facts that doesn't seem to fit very well. So it's actually been one after another. And so this is not a small thing. And of course, any one of these crises imposes, we've seen sustained losses. Each of these crises was followed by a prolonged slowdown in growth. It arguably never got back onto the old trend. So that, these are not small events. Now, it's possible. I mean, it's true. If you can go back to the world as it was in the 1950s, when money was very cheap, but we had very highly regulated banking systems, that didn't seem to be a dangerous world. And if you can tell me how I can control the power of the banking lobby enough to get back to there, that would be the issue.
I point taken, but I do feel that we sort of, I think we need to also take on the banking lobby. I sort of feel like this conversation, I always feel uncomfortable, not because you're wrong, but because I feel that there is a need to have a financial system that plays by some reasonable set of rules rather than sort of throwing out the baby. I think that's the danger, and that's the danger that we kind of need to manage by actually being somewhat ruthless about the financial sector. We haven't managed that. Even in the US, we kind of threatened for a while and then didn't do it. But I do feel that that's part of the global demand should be for a much more regulated financial sector. I absolutely don't.
Boring banking.
Boring banking, absolutely.
Well, that's right.
How much closer are you after the regulations that have been introduced?
Well, I mean, Dodd-Frank has actually got a lot more. It's far short of what you would have wanted, but there's a lot more teeth to it than people recognize. It's a significant set of regulations, which is why the new Congress in the United States is their second order of business. Their first order of business is to destroy the environment. The second order of business is to destroy the new banking regulations, and they're working on it. And I do fear that it will be rolled back. That even the things that we have achieved will be lost. So it's extraordinary. I mean, I have to say I didn't see that coming. I thought that it would be like at least bankers would remain unpopular and would lose their political influence, but not so.
But the way they calculate their capital requirement, whether you count derivatives or not, etc., ultimately they actually manage to do with very little capital and still remain highly leveraged.
Well, Dodd-Frank, too much information, but Dodd-Frank does give the Financial Stability Oversight Council, essentially top officials, the ability to say, you are a strategically significant institution and we're going to come down and take a good hard look and be sure that you have enough capital. And that's a very serious thing. That's not a purely symbolic designation, because when an institution is designated as strategic, they scream bloody murder. They really hate it. So it's significant, but that's why, again, the political pressure is enormous. And no, I mean, when you see Jamie Dimon up there saying, you must not do this regulation because J.P. Morgan is a national champion, and we must be competitive in the world financial system, and you really get a kind of a sick feeling at the pit of your stomach.
So on a slightly different plane, Professor Krugman has been a big exponent of fiscal expansion during a slowdown. But there are two problems in the current world. One is that an economy like India, if it begins to talk about expanding the fiscal space, immediately all the rating agencies will clamp down, and you might see a crisis of confidence and capital flight, and the economy going down the drain. Second problem is, given the level of interconnectedness among countries, there's a very real danger that fiscal expansion leads to a huge amount of leakage from the economy that is carrying out the expansion to other economies which are actually better able to satisfy the goods and services that are demanded. So how do we tackle this in the current globalized world?
I mean, I'm not going to be able to say anything that's not right. It's going to be all these dangers. But I don't think we have a choice. I mean, frankly, I think I've been a bit obsessed by the banking sector right now. I think once we start the bailout, I think either we're going to... So one of the dangers we have is doing too little. Because I think that's, if I think of what's going to be among the dangers for us, is doing too little now. Because I think what that's going to do is going to stall growth. And once growth is stalled, then we'll get the same dangers from the rating agencies. I do feel that we can't afford to be very conservative. We're in deep trouble. And we're in deep trouble because, I think this huge amount of bailout that will be needed, and we can half do it, but then the banking sector won't provide finance. If it doesn't provide finance, our growth will be slow. And we need infrastructure. The companies need to do something. I mean, there's a set of things we need to do, and maybe we need to do it much more transparently than we usually do it. The last time we had a banking bailout, there was money handed out to the rich because the loans got cancelled and nothing happened. We should do it more transparently, but make it clear that this is needed for a long term. I do think that the idea of doing kind of sitting on that regulatorily pretending that crisis doesn't exist, and then therefore having a tight fisc is going to be as dangerous as going in the opposite direction. Because I think once people think that our growth story is not happening, then money will leave, and then we'll have all the problems that we have. So I don't think that we're riding a tiger right now, but I think we need to recognize we're riding a tiger. When you ride a tiger, there's no point trying to be nice to the tiger.
Yeah, and first of all, the rating agencies are, when you're borrowing in your own currency, and also when you are a fairly large player, the rating agencies matter not at all. I mean, Japan has had a number of downgrades because they keep on worrying about it, and at last I looked, I guess, which was yesterday, the Japanese 10-year bond rate was 0.26%, right? So that's you have to ask how vulnerable is India to India is not Greece, India is not Indonesia. It has some significant corporate foreign currency debt, but it's not nearly in that same league of vulnerability. And about the leakages, I mean, they exist. They're certainly an issue, but the world is not flat. Get in trouble with my colleague at the New York Times on that. It's even very small economies. 70% of GDP comes from essentially non-tradable sectors. It's just not the case that even very small countries that an expansion of domestic demand just leaks abroad. On those grounds, even small, even very open economies, you can have an economy where exports are more than 100% of GDP, imports are more than 100% of GDP, but that's because of value-added, breaking up the value chain, and it's still the truth that 70% of the economy is non-traded. So you don't want to overstate that. It's not a trivial thing, but it's not a fundamental reason to think that fiscal policy is ineffective.
Let me ask you something in the global economy. What sense does it make to measure the strength of an economy purely on the basis of GDP? Because if you look at the US, the corporate power that the US can muster, I mean, ultimately all these global companies still go crying to one home government when some trouble happens to it somewhere outside. So in that sense, they are not really global. They have some domicile. There's some government to which they take recourse to. Now, the total power of such companies, intellectual property, the financial reserves they have, when all this is combined, the difference between the US and China far, far outstrips the difference between GDPs of these two economies. So purely by looking at GDPs, don't you think it will be highly misleading to gauge the strength of nations or the ability to withstand global turbulence?
Boy, I would not. I mean, it's certainly true that the reach of, if you include corporations that are at least nominally American, it's a much bigger reach. But it's not clear to me that the U.S. government has a particular special role there. Let me give this two different kinds of answer. One is, if you look at, from the point of view of international influence, it's got to be GDP at market exchange rates, not at PPP. It's not clear at all why, the fact that by some purchasing power measures, China is a bigger economy than the United States matters not at all for any kind of international power relations. It might matter if we had a war, but that's not hopefully part of the plan here. At market values, China is still, it's somewhat bigger than Japan, but not that much bigger than Japan even now. So the fact that China appears to be a relatively limited player in many ways is not inconsistent with what the GDP is telling you. In terms of influence on corporations, in terms of being able to tell corporations what they can and can't do and being able to influence them, the US has enormous leverage because it's a huge market. So does the European Union. If you look at issues of competition policy, you look at issues of trade policy, there are two superpowers in the world, and they are the US and the EU. The EU may be a midget when it comes to military power. It may be unable to cooperate fiscally, but it's got enormous leverage in trade policy. It has enormous leverage. If you are a Google or Microsoft, you are every bit as afraid of European regulators as you are US regulators.
I guess I'm going to do something unfair. I think if we had to, I thought when you started talking about GDP not being a measure of something relevant. I was going to think that we should talk about a very different dimension of the US-India relationship, and that's climate change. I think this opportunity with President Obama coming and what Prime Minister Modi has been saying in the last few days is massive. It's, in terms of what India could do for the world and for the US right now, letting Mr. Obama go back with some triumph on that, on climate change, with some India. I think India and the US have colluded for the last many, many years on blocking every possible sanity on this question. Each of us provides the other one with an excuse by misbehaving. And I think this is an amazing opportunity.
I thought China made sure that they didn't need us.
Oh yeah, there's China as well, but India and the US do a pretty good job by themselves in a sense in providing Obama with every excuse for not doing anything. And I think right now the Republicans, as Paul was saying, are going to fix anything, even the very little that he has tried to do. So I think we're in a place where we can really have influence on the US and the world by doing something sensible now, by sort of agreeing to things that Mr. Modi has been saying. But I don't know whether in the end they will turn into, we'll just get wrapped up in one word here and one word there and tangle up and fall in a heap, which is what usually we manage to do. But it's really like totally first order. We want to have one influence. Forget about interest rates and this and that. This is just first order. This is where the US and India really connected.
And at the psychological moment, we just had, it's now official that 2014 was the warmest year ever, which is meaningless, right? If you actually understand the statistics and noisy data, but it doesn't matter. The point is it actually makes a peg for this is the moment to actually do something.
Coming back to that original question, what should countries do with their surpluses? If you don't want to put it in a financial center from where the intermediation might not be particularly healthy, what do we do?
I'll say one thing. That's not answering your question, right? I still think, one thing we really need to do is create a climate for FDI. I do feel that ASEAN is sitting on a huge amount of money, which it sort of has the same problem in a sense as Japan had with a lag. And I think they are sitting on a huge amount of money that needs to go somewhere. I think if we created the right climate, I think there would be opportunities for FDI. I think that's the first order. The first order fact about the world is that FDI is typically useful. Everything else is questionable. And I think we should start with the idea that we should facilitate FDI, really facilitate it. This bunch of bills stuck in Parliament that would make it much easier, but also just generally everything is a negotiation. I talked to some investors, and the first reaction is, we would love to do it, but it's going to be such a headache.
Yes, and actually the socially responsible thing for countries that do have large reserves is, in fact, given that we do seem to have this problem of too much money chasing safe assets, then it is sovereign wealth funds. In fact, so I think from India's own point of view, FDI, yeah, you're right, FDI, international capital flows are extremely dubious in general, but not FDI. FDI does not have that track record of causing problems, and conversely, if you don't want to contribute to the problem, if you're a surplus country, you really should be promoting direct investments rather than parking your money someplace.
But isn't that sort of kicking the can further down the line?
No,
because
no.
Ultimately, if you can't get your own domestic banking sector in order, if you can't get your own domestic infrastructure investment and building in order, how do you expect FDI, even if you legally allow, regulatorily allow money to come in, how will it make any sense?
Everything's capital. I mean, the fact that you can run these things is capital, can you build infrastructure is capital. They're not any less capital than the money that's capital. We don't have that capital.
Maybe more so, yeah.
Yeah, maybe more so.
Sure. We have more time.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I mean, clearly there's some things. FDI is not going to provide pure public goods. Yeah. Although there might be even ways to do that if you do some kind of partnerships. But the main thing is, yes, I mean, the government's going to have to build roads but there's. I think I know Latin America better than I know India, and Latin Americans have always regretted loans, bonds. They've always regretted selling those things. They have not regretted when Toyota goes in and builds an auto plant. They've not regretted it when somebody comes in and builds. Actually, railroads were built by private enterprise there originally. Those have. Even if it wasn't always the best investment, it was a real investment, and the money does not pick up and at the first hint of trouble and go home because it's embodied in real physical capital.
No, what I mean to say is that in India's power sector, 30% of all the power that is produced is not paid for. It is 30% of the power that is generated is not paid for. It is either lost in transmission and distribution, or it is actually stolen. And now, in that kind of a situation, even if policy says 100% FDI and power is allowed, what use is it?
I think that's a question of what particular stance the government is going to take on the subsidy. I mean, whether or not what the price is, who pays for it. These are. If we don't fix the power sector, we're not growing. So who pays for it, we'll have to figure out. But that's a question not, even if 50% were lost, the other 50% is useful, and then it's a question of transfer from, and I understand that we have to fix all our governance problems, but they're no easier than any other problem to solve. I mean, it's not, this is what I'm trying to say. This is all capital. We don't have the capital, that's kind of the social and institutional capital to do these things well. This is not going to happen in a day any more than anything else will happen in a day. Till we're going to fix every problem before we get FDI, then we'll have to wait for a long time. I really do think that we need to be much more clear that we're going to lose money on some of these things, and but this is the need of the day, and we can't sort of. I think facilitating, I do agree with you that the way we do PPPs is ridiculous, and many of them are designed for being people being held up, the government being cheated. They're designed for that. You look at the design of it and say, how could that contract ever been written? But I think this is where we can get some global expertise. We can try a little harder. We can be more transparent. But I do think that this is our moment. If we want to really do the infrastructure, we have to get FDI. I don't think there is a second answer to that question.
Would you have anything to say on this?
No, I mean, now you do want someone who has expertise in structuring these things, but they exist, as Abhijit said. I mean, this is something that there's a lot of global experience. So intellectually, it's not hard. Politically, it's hard. Everything is hard politically, but I think that's not the problem.
See, a whole lot of invisible surpluses are actually with companies. companies around the world are sitting on huge piles of capital. And now they choose not to invest. So what do? This is part of the problem of surplus savings. There being extra cash sloshing around the system, seeking deployment, but not actually finding any.
Well, in the United States, obviously where I know it best, yeah, I mean, we have corporations sitting on, yeah, the estimates vary, but let's say $2 trillion of cash, which is sitting in banks or sitting in short-term safe assets. And on the other hand, we have collapsing water systems and inadequate highways, actually, even though I'm not a big fan of the automobile. We have the greatest city in the world, which is not Delhi, I'm sorry, is New York. No, at least from my point of view, is connected by rail by one tunnel, which was completed in the year 1910 and runs at 100% of capacity during rush hour. So all of these things, and if all that corporate cash, households are still not saving very much, but corporations are sitting on all of this stuff, and they're willing to lend it out at essentially a zero real rate of return. So use it to pay for infrastructure. The same is definitely true in Europe, although it's harder to organize, and that's now.
And Japan too.
Well, Japan has actually built a lot of infrastructure. One thing one does want to say is, and by the way, Japan, you know, we used to use Japan as a cautionary tale. When you compare Japan's period of disappointing economic performance with what has happened in the United States and even more what's happening now in Europe, Japan doesn't look so much like a cautionary tale as like a role model. They manage decline a whole lot better than the rest of us are doing. No, I mean, but no, seriously, if you say, did Japan make a mistake by building all of that infrastructure during the years of very low interest rates and very low growth? And I think it's hard to say they did. They did maintain employment. They did. If you look at the way it comes back to the demography, Japan's growth per working age adult is not that bad. It should have been better, but it has not actually fallen that far behind on that measure. The biggest problem Japan has is an insufficient number of Japanese, and that's increasing the problem in Europe as well. And that, by the way, coming back to American revival, although the United States is by no means doing wonderfully, the one great advantage among advanced countries that the United States does have is that it has a higher fertility rate and remains, despite everything, culturally relatively open to immigration.
Absolutely. I think the US's great strength is that it's open and it has populations growing. It's grown over the last, basically that's the one country in the OECD which has had substantial population growth.
Although, by the way, even in the United States, we've seen our working age population growth, I think, is now down to from 1% a year to 0.4 or thereabouts.
I agree.
I mean, in Europe, it's now minus 0.4. I mean, Europe has turned Japanese with astonishing speed. But so the United States has a demographic problem too, just not as bad as the rest. As I say, this kind of race as to who can do worst, and the United States is losing that race.
But the US is better at immigration. That's one of its
desirable though this might be, as you said, it always happens in the political economy context. So immigration, even if it's good for the economy, might not be good for certain sections of the U.S. people.
I have to say one thing. This is partially a U.S. conversation. I think it's interesting that anti-immigrant sentiment, although obviously it's there in the United States and it's a political issue, has never really gained the kind of traction that people keep expecting. People keep on thinking that extreme anti-immigrant stuff is going to be a big political winner, and it never is. And right now the Republicans, Obama is bypassing them to use executive action, and they're trying to stir up mass public outrage, and it's just not happening. I think maybe too many people in the United States know immigrants, too many people have family histories of being immigrants. It's just doesn't. It's interesting because Europe, obviously, it's a terrible thing. People in Europe should be protesting austerity and inadequate monetary policies, and instead, mostly they want to beat up the immigrants. But in the United States, it's not working that way. Again, the strength of the United States. There's a lot wrong with America. I mean, half our political spectrum is, to use the technical term, batshit crazy. But we do have this openness.
Now, the OECD and later the G20 have caught on to what they call a program to end base erosion and profit shifting by multinational companies. They find that the way multinational companies plan their taxes, they end up not paying any tax virtually in any jurisdiction. So there is a concerted effort to put an end to this. Now, do you think this is one way that will actually fix this problem of capital actually remaining idle, being untaxed, not being deployed, and just doing particularly nothing?
I don't think this is a correlator. I think when the cash was scarce, they were doing the same thing. Just essentially, unless we have much more coordination on these things, I mean, the tax havens and everything, I mean, in a sense, the biggest, from the macroeconomy, the biggest global public good might be that, which is that just this ability to tax shift, and I mean, it's really an amazingly, the fact that Apple never pays any taxes. These are just scandals, and I'm glad that people are. But I don't think it's much to do with the savings. I think it is. I mean, in a sense, it cuts either way. I mean, if the rate of return on your capital is very high, you have an incentive to invest. It's not that you have an incentive to sit on cash. It just, I think that reflects a separate problem.
Although I would say something I've learned from Hyun Shin, my Princeton colleague, is that the institutional structures that make all this tax avoidance possible are very intertwined with the structures of shadow banking. Shadow banking, which was more shadow banking more than anything else that made the regulatory framework so inadequate, is a much more internationalized thing than people realize. If you ask, we talk about the U.S. shadow banking sector, and a lot of that actually runs through London, and a fair bit of it ends up running through the Bahamas and all of that stuff, and it ends up being many of the same conduits that are used to make profits disappear where they're taxed and pop up where they aren't. So I think the point is that if we can get serious about closing down, about essentially enforcing the law on a cooperative basis, then it's going to help on both fronts. And yeah, this is something that's a very worthy thing for the OECD to be doing.
Would you say that this is somewhat related to the other problem you discussed yesterday? That if you look at the percentile income distribution, the one right at the top, that one percentile, they grow at a phenomenal pace, and the rest of the society hardly grows, particularly rich countries.
Some of it. Who do corporate profits ultimately accrue to? Would be primarily there. To some extent, we're talking. I think to a lesser extent, but some extent, individual tax avoidance
they call it tax planning.
Right. I gather the Mr. Romney is running again, and does he have was it $140 million retirement account or something, tax sheltered in overseas? Perfectly legal, but that's more telling you what's scandalous is what is legal. No, it's clearly related. Also, I don't this. Yeah, I mean, if you're if there are it has interesting effects in large parts of the most expensive district of London, to a lesser but significant extent New York, are essentially empty because it's all tax avoiding capital from the global 1% that is seeking a haven there.
See, there is a lot of angst in the U.S. about the growing inequality in the U.S. since the 1980s, perhaps. At the same time, the very same processes that have shifted jobs in tradable manufacturing and increasingly tradable services outside the US, which has actually contributed to incomes rising in countries like China and India. So while the income inequality has worsened in the US, that same process actually narrowed income inequality between the US and many other countries. It has improved a lot of lives in countries like India, China, and all over Asia. So is it possible for the political economy to take this in while assessing this process?
I mean, the first order factor with the US is that the US has an extraordinary bias against ever doing anything harsh against the rich. I mean, I think that's the first order factor with the US, is that US as a nation loves the rich. So I think the first order fact is that there is domestic policy that you could have done a lot in the US to fix the inequality, which it didn't. I mean, I think that one should first order think of it as being, the basic lesson from trade theory, that you figure out what is the efficient use of resources, and then you use redistributive policy to fix it. I mean, that's the first lesson, and the one lesson that I think is deeply misleading, because most countries don't do that. They do one and then forget about the other. But it's not that the instruments don't exist. The instruments exist, and some countries have done it better than others. So it's not the case that, the reason why much of continental Europe has not seen this same kind of increase in inequality has something to do with social policy. It's not that they are not exporting jobs. They're exporting jobs very fast. In fact, in a sense, their manufacturing died faster in some cases than in the US. So I don't think I think one should think of this as being, to first order, a kind of a consequence of political will in the Anglo-Saxon countries, that the Republicans love the rich. I think
fair number of Democrats too. Yeah, no, and let's say that even among Anglo-Saxon countries, while it's the U.S. is extreme inequality, the UK much, Canada not as much, and it's hard to say that Canada is not a globalized economy. It's even more open than the U.S., but it has been somewhat more willing to tax at the top, and even more crucially, it's been much more willing to spend on people in need. And then, of course, if you go to Scandinavia, again, a highly open economy. So it's not as, you don't have to, it's a false choice. You can be pro-globalization, to answer our absent colleague. You can say that you're in favor of it, while recognizing that the direct effects may be to worsen income inequality in the North, but that's okay, provided that you have adequate policies to contain that effect, which we don't, but we could.
If you look at the current world, one of the features after the crisis has been this institutional attempt to coordinate policies among governments through this G20 process. They want to harmonize financial regulation. They want to better harmonize tax information and tax policies. They want to look at climate change, a whole range of development issues. But at the core is tax and finance. What do you think are the chances of these things actually make some tangible progress?
I guess I am reasonably optimistic on that. It's something that it's something that even politicians understand, that if you have very different taxes, very different, that regulatory arbitrage, tax arbitrage, is not a hard concept to grasp and is very visible. The incentives are there to do it. There's incentives for individual countries to be bad actors, but if largely if the United States and Britain agree that they don't want to allow people to do really nefarious stuff financially, that's enough to make it happen, I think, around the world. On taxes, it's a bigger thing, but if the U.S. and the European Union in general agree that there's a lot of room. So I think that in the end, these are issues that are something like trade policy. And trade policy is one of the great triumphs. You know, we went from a highly protectionist, fragmented world to a world of low and harmonized barriers, and we did it through international negotiation, and it does show that you can do these things. So no, I'm actually pretty optimistic on these. You're going to fight some special interests, but that's always true. And well, maybe famous last words, but this should be doable.
What do you think?
I have no particular reason to. I have no reason to disagree. I think it should be doable, and I don't see. I mean, it's sufficiently. It's possible to sufficiently bury it in kind of inter-country, like nitty-gritty details that it might actually not hit the political spotlight too early. So I think there is a reasonable chance that it will happen. I think.
Yeah. The first step in this entirely reasonable process would have been to raise the IMF quotas of countries like India and China, which the US Congress has so far refused to.
No, but you see now you're playing, that's the point. I think Abhijit is saying if we can do things like harmonization of tax information and so on, you might be able to do that in a way that basically that Fox News doesn't notice, right? Whereas something like money for the IMF, we're giving money to these global bureaucrats who are going to use it to buy black helicopters that will come and whatever. It's just the.
I totally agree. Yeah. I think we should go with. I think harmonization sounds like beauty, and so we can get away with it.
That's right. But giving money, the IMF, particularly international institutions like that, really play into a certain kind of specifically American paranoia that is just sort of part of the air I breathe. But hopefully, we won't inflict on the rest of the world too much.
So you think India and China are wasting their time trying to pursue this increase in their quotas and rearrange the voting power in the IMF?
It's probably
a good signal for the domestic audience.
It's fine. Yeah, it's good for them to be talking about doing it, and who knows, maybe when one of the Bush nephews becomes president, or when Chelsea Clinton becomes president, we can get this stuff done. But that's Hillary's daughter, by the way, in case you were wondering.
Now, if the IMF and the World Bank, etc., cease to be central pillars of the financial system, then the response would be for countries of the South, for China, India, to get together and form things like the BRICS Bank or the such kind of institutions. China is becoming a major financial intermediary in itself. What do you think? How will this play out? Will this actually incentivize the US Congress to rethink in order to check this kind of decentralization or fragmentation of their power? Or will it sort of let this happen?
I think the first order problem is that B and R have negative growth right now. So I think this is about, before it becomes a big issue for anybody, this has to happen. And C might be heading towards low growth too. And I think I is up in the air. So I think we can count the chickens.
I mean, you have to say well, first of all, I mean, if you're saying, will this get the attention, whose attention exactly are we talking about? I mean, if your notion is that there are people thinking hard about this in the U.S. Congress, anyway, there's not much thinking hard about anything in the U.S. Congress.
No.
I don't know if that's been updated. The last I saw, it was just a few years ago, only half of U.S. members of Congress actually had passports. Right, so we are a more insular nation than India at this point. We don't actually believe that the rest of you exist.
Okay. So the big picture we have been discussing for nearly an hour. Ultimately, what sense we get is that unless we get our own house in order first, there isn't much recourse that the rest of the world can do to help us get our growth together. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a session.